So guys, in this video I'm going to show you how to make a super small scale diorama, putting some techniques that I know down but into very small scale. Now to get the terrain that I need for this, I'm going to need a very high resolution printer to print such small details. The reason the Sonic Mini 8K is so good for this is the highest resolution consumer printer in the world at the moment. And printing these little buildings down to 6mm, even though they're really small, I still want razor sharp details, and this printer captures them details brilliantly. And a lot of this has to do with the fact you can print down to 22 microns, which is unbelievable. Now, these prints come off absolutely brilliantly with a quick clean in methylated spirits and removing the supports with some hot water. The models have just come out perfectly. I printed about 4 beds worth of these because I'm going to need a lot, because as you can imagine, these small houses, they don't really fill up much space, and I'm only doing a diorama that's the size of a A5 piece of paper roughly, so I'm going to need a lot of them. Now these models are from the Lazy Forger. He has his own little 6mm game, and these terrain are from that game system. And the reason that I've picked them is they're a little bit different. It's something that is just going to be nice to do, like a little shanty town. And the buildings have got loads of characters, and there's loads of different types of buildings, and the fact that the little walkways and ladders and stairways have come off just adds to that extra detail. And it's a way of doing an almost post-apocalyptic sci-fi type diorama without going too sci-fi. Now, to paint these up, with them being a lot smaller, I'm going to try and paint as much of the detail as I can, but they're small, so I'm not going to go over the top. What I'll do to start is dry brush everything with a silver dry brush. The reason I'm going to do this is if I miss anything, or if there's any areas that I can't reach, it's going to show as metal, and that means that it'll look like damage or weathering. Now the problem with small scale things like this, we can't use many products that are out there for weathering, like adding rust pigments and things like that, because the grains in them can be quite big. So what I'm doing to get around this is I'm just stippling paint on there and not actually going up to the edges. I'm painting them quite roughly. And this is so we've got the colours breaking through from the dry brush underneath. And this is like adding texture without actually adding texture. Now once I've got all them coloured base coats on painted in the same way, I'm chucking a black wash on this, and this is just to sink into the recesses to add contrast, because with them being so small, it might look quite big on camera, but to your eye and when they're down on the table, that contrast really helps. And then just to lift them highlights and paint some details that I physically can't paint, I'm just doing a dry sand dry brush over the top. And the reason I'm using this sandy colour is the dio I'm going to put in a sandy setting, so it'll give like a dusty film filter over all the models. And this just makes all the paint work and everything on the buildings look a lot more consistent. Tying them together, making them look like they've been painted roughly at the same time and they've all been weathered at the same sort of time. And that dusty dry brush really does just finish them off. And as you can see, that dry brushing just highlighted the tops of them stones, which I physically couldn't paint, and just finishes them off nicely. Now, one last thing that I thought I'd try, because I put them all on the table and I thought maybe I can get away with one more step. I've got a flesh wash and I put this over the yellow first to see whether it works, and it worked very well. So over the bottom of panels and edges of panels, I used a flesh wash over most of the models just to add rust and another form of texture, even though it's not real texture. For the base of this dio, I am using 100mm thick blue foam, and I'm going to be using some foam tools to make the landform that I'm going to be sticking these down to. Now, I've not actually made many landforms like this before, so I don't really know what I'm doing, but in my head I want it lower at the front and obviously higher at the back. So all I'm doing is just going through, taking layers and layers and layers of foam off until I get to this rough shape that I want. It would be nice to have more of a idea in mind, but I find it quite hard to work in reverse. Usually I build foam up, I don't normally cut into foam to do it, but it was very nice to do this for a change. It's quite relaxing, makes you feel quite creative even though you're just carving into foam. Now, once you've got the rough landform, I'm going to sand this smooth. Now, every terrain builder needs one of these detail sanders. They make life so much easier for so many reasons. I'll put links to them below because I use them all the time. Now, I'm sanding this down and getting as smooth as I possibly can, just so we've got space to put the houses so they're not up and down and all over the place. For detailing like rocks, I'm going to be using cork bark, but because the terrain piece is so small, I'm literally cutting the detailed bits off the front of the bark. It's very easy to do with a razor saw, and once you've got that cut off, we can stick them in place, and it's so much better than using big lumps of bark. Now, once you've determined where you're going to put your pieces, usually I'd stick these in with compound, but I'm not going to do it that way because I want it to stay the rough shape that it is now and I don't want to change it too much. So what I'm using to stick this in place is a product called Pink Grip. It's like a caulking gun style adhesive, but I'm using it because it's solvent based and it dries awfully quickly. And you can use it like a putty. So all you've got to do is just grab a little bit on your fingers and just smush it behind the piece and lay it down, and within 10-15 minutes it's grabbed it firm so you can carry on working. And it's a very quick one to do if you are going to build landforms like this. Now I'm painting the whole thing with just an emulsion, and this is just to get the main colour of the foam out and change the colour of the rocks because I'm going to go for a more sandy climate. And just paint this on. Don't worry if it's a bit patchy because we're going to be covering this with ground materials and stuff anyway. Now once that's dry, get yourself a good layer of fast dry basing glue down. Brush that everywhere where you're wanting your base ground covers to go. Now work from coarse to fine. So I'm using Arid Earth Base Ready for the coarse areas, with this being such small scale. And then once we've got that down and we've got like the fallen and rough ground textures of the rocks and adding to the rock faces, I'm going to be using tile grout and soil mixed together, and I'm going to be sieving this to get it as fine as possible over the top of the entire diorama, because you can't really use many sands or anything like this in this sort of scale because a grain of sand's far too big. So that's why I'm using a mix of soil and tile grout for the general covering. Once that's on there, we need to seal that down with the matte Scenic sealant and let that dry. Now once that is all completely dry, I'm coming in with the airbrush and I'm going to start painting this up to the colour that I require. So I'm just using some sand colours through the airbrush and I'm just building up the layers to get it to a natural bright colour that I want. And the only two colours that I used in this is the earth brown and like a desert yellow. But what I'm doing is I've got it very thin in the airbrush and I'm using that brown that's on from the material beneath, and I'm just building up the layers till it lightens up where I want it to lighten up. After that, to add some depth to the rocks, I've watered down some inks to almost like a grey colour, really watered them down. And the reason I've done this is I didn't want to change too much of the stone, but I wanted the stone to be slightly different colour to the actual sandy areas. So that's why I've made it so thin that it's grey. But what I'm doing is I'm laying this on so it goes everywhere over the stony areas, and then I'm coming in with water and then feathering that out so it blends into the ground. Not something I've done before like this, but I really liked the outcome once it had dried. Once all that had dried up, I'd laid the buildings in a rough area that I wanted them, and to attach all these, I was just using super glue. Now the biggest problem with attaching these is the ground form obviously isn't that flat because I cut it with the foam cutter, so it's not perfectly flat in the areas that I want buildings. So what I'm doing is I'm sticking them as flat as I can in areas where I think they'll fit best. Now I'm not even worrying if some of the buildings look like they're floating on one contact point, because I am going to fix this later. It was a bit of an oversight when I was making the ground cover. I didn't really think of the the small squares that these would need to be flat, and the smallest inclination in the ground form just lifts the building up massively with it being so small. It's not something you have to take into account when you're working on massive terrain, but when you're working on something this small, a little lump or a little bump just throws everything out of whack. So I had to come up with a way to fix this. And Daryl at work, he mixes up sand and PVA glue as a filler. So that's what I've done. I've seen him use it on many of his builds, and I thought, you know what? This will work perfectly for underneath all the buildings because I can get it into place. It's got the sand colours in it, so when it dries it will be a bit paler than what I've got, but we can wash that down. It is a bit fiddly to work with, but the best thing about it being just PVA and sand, it does shrink a little bit, so it's not as bumpy, and you can feather it out like a paint. So it's just like a texture paint really, but a little bit easier to work with, and you know that it's going to shrink away because it's PVA glue. And it does a very good job, and it also makes it rock solid to the board when it's fixed. While that's drying, I'm just spraying up some sea foam to a very dark brown colour, and the reason I'm doing this is I want some foliage and trees around just to add some height, colours and textures, just to make it look a bit more interesting than sand and buildings. And I'm just using a bit of glue and some fine green light foam over the top. All the links to all the products used will be in the description below. Now once that sand glue paste is all dried, I'm literally just chucking a brown wash over the top of it. But what I'm doing is I'm spreading it out as thin as it can go, and as you'll see, the colour is almost identical to the painted area that I did prior. I am going to be chucking some foams and stuff to really disguise it, but just the wash on its own hid it great. And then when I come in with some green and browny foams around like the edges of where areas would be built up with foliage, it just hides and blends it all away and makes it look a hell of a lot more natural without having floating buildings everywhere. For walkways and paths, I'm literally just brushing it away with a brush because the foam's so fine. I'm just revealing the ground texture from underneath where it'd be like compressed sands and dirt and everything. And it's as simple as that. And I'm just using a thick brush to do it, and that's as thick as the walkway needs to be at this scale. For planting the trees, I'm literally using little blobs of super glue on the stems and a bit of activator to put them all in place. With placement, don't think about it, just throw them in areas until you feel that there's enough. And that way, whatever place you decide to put it down first, just put it there. Don't think about it and take pieces away, because in nature, things are a bit random. So be as random as you possibly can. Now, I really enjoy building this diorama. It's something that I've been wanting to do to practice my terrain skills for smaller scale wargaming, and practicing it on a little dial like this has turned out amazing. The models from the Lazy Forger are absolutely stunning, and the fact that I can print them with so much detail with the Phrozen Mini 8K is just unreal. So I will love to build a little gaming table around this style, like a District 9 sort of feel. It just looks amazing. What do you think? Put in the comments below. Now, I'd like to thank Phrozen for sponsoring this video and making it possible. If you've liked this video, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And if you want to see more videos like this, drop a comment below. All the links to all the products used will also be in the links below, and I'll catch you again for the next one. Love, love, love.